Good evening, everybody. We have a few more people still coming in, so we're just going to start the introduction fairly slowly. I won't talk too slowly, I promise. My name is Steve Tinney, and you may remember me from last year. It's nice to have you all back, those of you who've come back, and for new faces, welcome. This will be our home this year for the Greats Lectures. The series is sold out, but I believe they are selling some tickets on the door as well, but as you can see, not everybody shows up. So, this year, our theme is the rise of the city. And it's a nice tie-in with the biggest reinstallation of galleries we've seen in many decades here at the museum, which is our new Middle East galleries, which will open in April 2018. I've been deeply involved in that process myself. I'm really excited by it, in part because it's almost done. It's been a huge job. We have about 1,400 objects in the 3 rooms, so plan to come more than once. And we've selected speakers. We've gone a little bit on a tangent to what we usually do with the greats, and we've selected speakers who can give us sort of a 360 of what cities are, why they exist, how they come to be, the different parts of the world and environments they grow up in. And the reason for that is that the subtitle of the Middle East Galleries is Journey to the City. And we follow not a simple linear progress, but we discuss cities from their very, very first origins in simple agricultural villages that produce something like the famous first wine jar, oldest wine jar, which has been fully restored and will be on display. Through to early Mesopotamian cities, temples, the city of Ur. There'll be an entire room devoted to the city of Ur, half of which is devoted to the gold materials essentially from the royal tombs of Ur, which will be really spectacularly laid out so you have time to appreciate it and space to appreciate it. And then in the third room, we will have a little bit of a breathless rush from about maybe 1300 BCE to the present day. If you blink, you'll miss it. But it's actually all very interesting because there are several story arcs, and some of them will come out in these talks, and some of them you'll see in the gallery. So we look forward to welcoming you to the gallery when it's open at the end of April. The next lecture in our series will be on November 1st, and will feature our own Dr. Joseph Wegner, Associate Curator in the Egyptian section, who will be talking about the lost cities of ancient Egypt. And as usual, after our speaker's presentation, there'll be some time for Q&A. I believe that Tina is going to walk around with the microphone in this smaller space. We don't have the microphones in the aisles, but if you could take the microphone for your questions, it'll make it easier for everybody to hear. And so to tonight's speaker, who's going to introduce us to some of the philosophy behind the city. To begin with, I want to avoid claims of plagiarism by admitting that at first I'm simply going to read excerpts from his bio, because it is so impressive that I did not feel I could improve it by editing. Peter Struck is the Evan C. Thompson Term Professor and Chair of the Department of Classical Studies in the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania. He is Director of the Benjamin Franklin Scholars Program and founder of its Integrated Studies curriculum. He is co-founder, with Sarah Ego, of the National Forum on the Future of Liberal Education, and has worked with foundations, news organizations, and scholarly societies to promote the liberal arts. He has won multiple teaching awards at Penn for innovation, including the Lindbach Award, the university's top teaching prize. He has published extensively on the intellectual history of Greek and Roman antiquity. His book, Birth of the Symbol, Ancient Readers at the Limits of Their Texts, won the Goodwin Award from the American Philological Association for Best Book in Classical Studies. I'm almost done. His most recent book is Divination and Human Nature, A Cognitive History of Intuition in Antiquity, and he has published widely on ancient philosophy, religion, magic and divination, and literary criticism, and given dozens of lectures at universities in the United States and Europe, and we're very happy to have him back to lecture again in the Great Series. So I could go on, but I feel the excerpts make my point. There could hardly be somebody more qualified to talk about this topic to you. And I would like to add a personal note. You've heard me say similar things to this before. It's very heartfelt. And the museum is really blessed, not only with its own highly professional staff and curators, many of whom also hold faculty appointments, but also with an amazing network of supporters across campus, particularly in departments like classical studies. Peter was the faculty supervisor last year of one of our undergraduate research students in our Penn Museum Fellows program, as well as agreeing to speak here tonight in our flagship public lecture series with an ease and alacrity that relieved us all, I can tell you. We are enormously grateful to all of our colleagues who so often demonstrate their support and commitment to the museum in ways like this, and it is a pleasure to be able to acknowledge our thanks to Peter for his support as well. So thank you, Peter. Please join me in welcoming Peter Struck.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Steve. I wish I could live up to it. I'll try. There's no gainsaying the last bit. We are very enthusiastic supporters of what the museum has done. It's a model, I think, for us in the humanities. Some of us working on the more arcane side of things to find a space to speak to a broader audience about what it is we're up to and why it's important. And it is heartfelt also coming from me to see a crowd like this that would come out and on a Wednesday night and listen to someone talk about ancient philosophical ideas of cities. But you'll tell me at the end whether it went well. I hope so. I am in the museum. I come here and I'm supportive and I'm happy to be here. I am mostly, though, we talk a lot about the importance of material culture in my field. I'm mostly, just by disposition, not because I think it's the right thing to be, but by disposition, I'm mostly an immaterialist. I like people thinking about imagining how material things might work, but I don't know my way around the material world at all. I'm much happier in the world of ideas. So what I'm going to talk about mostly tonight is ideas and imagination and the ideal imagining of what a city could be among a group of different thinkers. I'm going to look at my talk today in three parts. I'll focus in on Homer for a little while, and then Plato, and then Aristotle. And we'll talk about how they thought a city, what a city was, and how it worked. So just a couple of places to begin. Here is our Greek term polis. It is what we'll be focusing on today for this evening for most of the talk, and it's going to have slightly different definitions in the different thinkers that we look at. But this is the term that we're looking at. The English, the characters in the Roman alphabet that correspond make it look like this. And our translation of city, it's a good place to start. But there's going to be much more that we're going to unpack about what this word is all about. So where are we going to be in our talk? Now, here's the Mediterranean, wide, expansive world, dozens of cultures with rich, deep histories. I'm going to be focusing in on just basically this piece right here. So we're going to work on one small part of this ancient Mediterranean world. When are we? Sorry? Okay. I always think I disappear, though, when we do the light. As long as you all don't go to sleep. No pillows allowed. All right, okay. I see that, Mom. It's just, I know how comforting it is to be in dark. Okay, you can see. Okay. So when are we? Well, there's now, and then go back 2,000 years, and you make it to the center of Rome. Okay, so that's already a big jump. 500 years before that, and we're at classical Athens. 250 years before that, we're with Homer. And then 500 years before that, we're with the Trojan War. So we're dealing with big hunks of time in this talk. I'll spend the first part talking about the Trojan War. And this is going to be Homer's rendition of the Trojan War. So we're looking at an account of the 13th century that comes from 500 years after the fact. And then I'm going to focus in on classical Athens, and that'll be the place that I spend the second 2/3 of the talk on. I want to just give you a little bit of terminology about these different periods, just in case it's going to be pertinent to bring up these terms here or there. Before 1100 BCE, the Bronze Age. Okay, we're talking about the Bronze Age, and that will be the time of that Homer is depicting in the Trojan War. Dark Age intervenes between the Bronze Age and Homer. Homer begins the archaic period, And then the classical period is this period from 500 to 323, where we'll spend 2/3 of the time today. So bronze, archaic period, and classical period, those are terms you'll probably hear me mentioning in the next few minutes. Okay. So we're going to start off with this person, Homer. This is a representation of Homer, or someone else. This is the old joke, but it's true enough. We really have no idea. This is what they thought Homer probably would have looked like 700 years after the fact. And whether they were basing that on someone's memory or some other rendition of Homer and another material that didn't survive, we just don't know. He lives in the 8th century BCE, and he hands down to us the epic poetry of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it's hard to overestimate how powerful he is, and the evidence that comes from Homer. And by that I mean, we have written records before Homer in the Greek material, but they're basically receipts from buying 10 goats from some guy, where the border is between my property and your property. That kind of thing. We got little shards of written down things that survive. And then all of a sudden here, tens of thousands of lines of beautifully crafted epic poetry, just opening up a rich, intense, strenuous picture of a culture, its psychology, its realities, its values. And so Homer as a witness is to us, he's irreplaceable. It's also the case that we don't have a lot of written records to corroborate anything that Homer says. So Homer kind of gets a free pass. And people who love Homer, I think, probably love that about him. People who are annoyed by Homer are probably annoyed by that. So what's Homer talking about with respect to our topic today? Homer is talking about Troy. Troy, massive citadel across the Aegean Sea from mainland Greece. It is well known at its time as a wealthy city. It is run by a family headed by a figure called Priam, and it has relations with Greek city-states around the Aegean Sea. So much is what we know from Homer. If I were giving this lecture 125 years ago, I might say something like, this is I wouldn't have this picture, first of all, and I would say something like, the Trojan War we think might have happened, but we're not sure. It would be sort of equivalent to talking about the trip of Jason and the Argonauts. There's lots of tales from antiquity, and this just happens to be a tale about the Trojan War. Then my colleagues in archaeology who made this museum and their other colleagues at other universities went and did some digging at the site that they thought was probably the logical place where Troy would have been, and lo and behold, they found a massive, very wealthy citadel that had been overrun many times in its history, and one very specific, likely, one very massive time it was overrun, around 1250 BCE, around the traditional date of the Trojan War. So we call that Troy. We call the event that erased it in 1250 the Trojan War, and that's probably now reasonable to say that there is a historical underpinning to Homer's epic. Let's just say to the general flow of Homer's epic. We found no details at the place to corroborate any of the specific details in Homer, and you can be sure that we looked hard for them. There was nothing that said, Priam slept here, or this is the shield of Achilles. I mean, and you know that they scrutinized every single piece. So none of the specifics of Homer are corroborated here, but we do have a general sense that such a thing happened. So what is a city as Homer represents it? Well, Troy is our example, and it's already interesting to start thinking about it, because the city, such as we have it in Homer's text, is the city of the enemy. It's the city of the folks that we've been fighting against. We see the Trojans at home. We see the Trojans with families who care about them, that miss them, that are crying over them. We see fathers and sons. We see wives and daughters and the whole gamut of rich household family life embedded in the city. It happens through Homer's depiction of our Trojans. So what is their city? What are the basic components of it? Well, the walls of Troy big focus of Homer's epic, of course, because our Greek army is trying to conquer Troy, so they're concerned about its walls. We hear a lot of description of those. They enter into different pieces of the narrative. A famous scene with some of the greats of the Trojan group sitting up on the walls looking out over the Trojan, or over the battlefield, and identifying different Greeks and Trojans out there, introducing us to the characters. They're impenetrable, very tough to get through. The Greeks do find a way through, but not by breaking them. They sneak in. Odysseus uses his Trojan horse scheme to get himself inside of there. In addition to the walls, we have a citadel at the top, a stronghold, so that should these walls be breached, that would be the place where we could hole up. There is also temples and a main temple at the center of the citadel, also protected. The temple's a standard piece of these large early Bronze Age settlements, these Bronze Age cities. So that's represented well in Homer. In addition to the walls, the citadel, we've got the temple, and then also always a marketplace. Marketplace is where things are done. Your political collection is made around a marketplace. Also, the economic activity centers in a marketplace. And one thing that might be of some maybe usefulness in trying to figure out what a marketplace, how a marketplace figures into what we're talking about. Agora is the Greek term for a marketplace. When you make that into a verb, Greek has a way of doing this. You change the ending and put on an EU, and then the O is just the personal ending. Agoreuo, so making the noun for market into a verb. In other words, what we'd call marketing, right? Marketing. For us, it's like selling stuff. I mean, it used to be, for the Brits, it's going and buying your butter. For us, I suppose it's figuring out a way to sell stuff on the broad public. Marketing in Greek just means to talk. So their term, the verb built out of that word for marketplace, is getting together collectively and hashing things out. It's a place for conversation, in addition to a place for the economic and political activity. Now, in Homer's rendition, we have a few cities that come up. I've listed them here. This is actually a representation of the long list in Book 2 of the Iliad of the catalog of ships. Homer wants to go through and tell you about the huge expanse of the Greek population that's present here at Troy. And he goes through and lists the individual citadels that they come from. None of them as grand as Troy, although Mycenae probably close to as grand as Troy, but probably not quite there. All of these would be lesser versions of that slide that we saw at the beginning, with walls, a citadel, a temple in which the civic religion of the city would unfold, and a marketplace. So these are a beginning point to see this, where Homer uses this designation of city. Now, how does this function in Homer's story, your city? City is a chief marker of your identity. It's among a group of three that are the most important markers of your identity. Number one is your name. So your name embodies who you are. Then, not surprisingly, then your lineage. Who are your parents? Where did you come from? And then number three, your city. So where you're from is as important as your name and your parents. Now, your city is the full and complete description of where you're from. So I'm guessing for most of us here, there would be no question about our own affiliate. If someone wanted to say, where are you from, right? We might have multiple answers. From Pennsylvania, from the United States, I'm from Philadelphia. In this context, there would be no question that the sole and unique identifier of any individual person is their city. Odysseus is an Ithacan. He also has a kind of larger tribal-ish affiliation with others nearby him. You might be a Boeotian or a Thracian, but that's just, it's like naming your neighbors or something. It's not who you are. It's not who you are. And it's surely not the case that, at least for the Greeks at this time, that being a Greek was something that meant anything to anybody. What meant something irreplaceable to everybody was their city. So it was the chief marker of your identity. Over and over, we see Homeric heroes identifying themselves. Who are you? What's your name? Where do you come? Who are your parents? And where do you come from? So the city functions in this way as a kind of core piece of identity. Now, most of what I've talked about so far is going to be applicable to the later cities, but there's some distinctive elements in Homer as well that are particular to this particular time, this early stage of the timepiece depicting. One way I think to think about what a city is in this early imagination, 1250 BCE, is to think about it as a kind of macrocosm of a microcosm. The microcosm is a household, and the city is like the big house of the king. So let's take just a quick look at what a house was in this world. We've got here a representation of Odysseus' house in Ithaca, something that we run into in the Odyssey. The house has a public space called an aule, and that would be where people would come. You know, the UPS guy would show up and be at the aule. Your friends might be there before they come inside. It's a collection space. Most anyone could just kind of walk on in there without invitation. Okay? A public space. Cities all have these public spaces, marketplace being the key one. Then inside of there is the oikos. That's the household itself. It has rooms in which the family would do their entertaining. So it's got spaces in which dinner parties would happen, close friends would come, and that oikos is an inner area. Then inside of the oikos are the inner rooms where people would sleep, where they'd have their private quarters. And this is even a more private and more intimate kind of space. And remember that layout that we had from the representation of Troy. A very broad area in which people that had business with the city might show up. A more close-in area where the family of the king would have its special place to do its entertaining and its connections with others. And then a more intimate inner space that would be the inner hallways of the city itself. And life would course through there. Now, this is a certain kind of political organization, obviously, that's represented by this understanding of the city. This is a time in which great kings ran individual city-states, the Mycenaean period. Troy was on this model, Mycenae on this model, and the other great city-states of the time. They were independent, fiercely independent, mostly fought against each other. On occasion, they would gang up in groups and go fight against some other. So when the Greeks show up here to annihilate Troy, they have, for the time being, put aside their differences so that the city-states are not fighting, Greek city-states are not fighting by each other, and put alliances together to go and fight Troy. Troy's done the same thing with city-states nearby it to have a group that's functioning fully together. But mostly what these are independent actors as political units. On occasion, they'll find a reason to band together. Okay. There is a particular specifics of the way cities get worked out. If you all have not read the Iliad in a while, go back and have a look at book 24. Achilles has killed everybody. He's been sulking inside of, he started the epic by mostly sulking inside of his tent. And then he finally comes back out because he wants to punish Agamemnon because Agamemnon didn't do right by him. So he decides as a young man that the right thing to do is to pout and let all of his friends get hurt. And that's going to hurt Agamemnon. Well, so he has kind of made this into his city. His little tent is where he's kind of been living. He goes out and does all his killing, and then he's back inside of the city. Priam, now absolutely distraught because his son has been killed by Achilles, goes back to Achilles' hut, leaves his city of Troy, and goes into Achilles' tent. Achilles' tent is more secure than Priam's city is. And there Achilles runs things like a king of a city does. So when Priam comes in, it's like an embassy to a foreign country. Priam then makes his case to Achilles that it's time for him to give back the body of Hector that Achilles has been torturing, desecrating after he's killed Hector. And Achilles and Priam make a connection. And Achilles finally sees some sense in what mercy might bring and does, in the only act of mercy really in the whole epic, give over the body. It is at the same time a connection of, I think, the city of Troy with the city that Achilles has made for himself. Don't have to tell you about the importance of Ithaca in the Odyssey. Odysseus is consistently and always trying to get home. It's his city that he's going to come back to. And his city is part of who he is, his family, his wife, and his son. Okay. So let's press on just a little bit, and we'll move from that opening understanding of how the city functions in Homer's tale and talk a little bit about another time. So we'll move forward now from a representation of 1250 BCE up to the classical period. And here we're going to look at Athens. So here's another representation of Greece, and down here is where Athens is situated. So historical Athens, at its height, around 500 BCE, grew to a city with a total population of around 500,000 people. That was massive for the time. There were 40 to 50,000 citizens, and the rest were non-citizens because they were the wrong gender, or because they happened to be visitors from other places, and it didn't make sense to grant citizenship to someone who wasn't of the place. The city was very homogeneous ethnically. It was understood to be basically a large extended family, and it was very cohesive. It was knit and built together. The city of Athens grew to this size of 500,000 between a period of about 200 years, from about 7,000 to from about 700 BCE to about 500 BCE. So it was massive growth. It was in the about 10,000 range, about 10,000 people in 700 BCE, and it grew to this 500,000 in just 200 years. So a huge expanse. During this time, the Athenians become extremely wealthy. That makes the city grow. And as they're doing this, they also come up with some inventions that have an important legacy in human culture. They invent tragedy, they invent democracy, and they invent philosophy. Now, I could go on a little bit about what I mean by that. I'll just say this about philosophy. It's true, the Greeks did not invent deep thoughts, right? So since we've known of humans, we imagine that they probably have had deep thoughts. But the Greeks invent a genre of writing that investigates thoughts only for themselves. And it becomes invented a couple of generations before the next figure we'll talk about. But the person we're going to focus on here, Plato, puts the most distinctive stamp. Here's where philosophy in the Western tradition really emerges, philosophy as a whole. Plato's dates are 427 to 347 BCE. His masterwork is probably fair to say that it's the Republic. He wrote great numbers of dialogues, but the Republic is the most extensive of them all, aside from the laws, but it's dreadful. It's really hard to read. The Republic is magnificent. The Republic is, so Plato's great work, and what it focuses on is our topic today. Plato wants to talk about the city and how to make a perfect one of those. How does this come up in his investigation? Well, he starts off with the question of what is justice, and Plato has Socrates sitting around with a group of people who are tossing out ideas about what justice, the best definition of justice, might be. Some spin out what is a Homeric idea of justice, which is that you should help your friends and harm your enemies. Standard. Okay, standard sort of. Homer's world is clear. It is morally unambiguous. Well, that's not true. It's morally deeply ambiguous, but it's always right to help your friends and hurt your enemies. That's not complicated. Now, that's tried out in this context of Plato's book, One of the Republic, and it's shot down instantly. It makes no sense to talk about that as a standard definition of justice. Someone, a slightly more cynical, younger person stands up and says, well, there's really no justice. It's only the will of the stronger. That's what winds up being declared to be just. Socrates shoots that down pretty quickly. So you're claiming that if someone who was stronger put a gun to your head and decided for no reason to threaten you and steal all your stuff, that would be just. And the person has to say, well, no, Socrates, it doesn't seem so. Okay, so fine. So maybe there is such a thing as justice? What's it going to be? The ideas that are tossed out don't hold water, so by the end of the first book, Socrates says, well, we're going to have to start off on figuring out what justice is. By the time they start moving through the second book, and there's 10 of them, he says, this is getting confusing. It's hard to figure out what justice is with an individual. So let's zoom out and look at the natural grouping of what human beings are as a large clump. That's a city. So let's try to find out what justice is in a city. So this philosophical investigation that started off trying to figure out what justice is turns out to be an investigation of how you're supposed to build the best city. So he starts off on a couple of sort of different vectors. This is the very beginning point. Socrates is talking to his interlocutor here, Aristotle. Socrates tells us a city comes to exist, I believe, because none of us is individually self-sufficient, but each has many needs he cannot satisfy. Or do you think that a city is founded on perhaps some other principle? Adeimantus. No, none, not true. Socrates. Then because we have many needs, and because one of us calls on another out of one need and on a third out of a different need, we gather many into a single settlement as partners and helpers. And so we call such a shared settlement a city. Isn't that so? Okay, so this seems like a good place to start. We've got our beginning of a city. People get together and help solve problems that they can rely on each other collectively to help one another out. We start off then, Socrates goes down and narrates what the city is going to look like. He talks about them getting together, and there's going to be a specialization of labor. And the first city with the small groups of people that get together is there to fulfill basic human needs. It gets food on the table in a more efficient way than we could individually by ourselves. It provides shelter for us and gives us clothes on our back. And Socrates says, well, okay, fine, so that's a start, but that's not much. And he says, well, that's actually just a city for pigs. It keeps food in our bellies, but we've got other purposes than that, don't we? So what else do we need? Well, the people he's having his conversation with jump instantly to the idea that, well, what we really need is to have luxuries. Socrates is not sure about that, but says, okay, fine, so let's get some luxuries in there. And if we start doing that and grow and get bigger, well, we're going to need an army to protect us. That's when things start to get really serious. We're going to need an army. So what are we going to do to make sure that that army can run this city well? That's a big question. So we're about a third of the way through the Republic, and Plato at this point says, how are we going to produce rulers that can rule us well? To make a good city means to make a city that's just. To make a city that's just means you need rulers that behave in a just way. Now, there are some times, I think, when you run into questions like this, where people will say, yeah, you should just do the right thing, right? You should just be just. How hard could that be? Well, living through your fourth and fifth and maybe sixth decades, you start to realize that, well, in fact, there's a huge amount that's difficult to figure out and difficult to find. And our friends at, I think it was Google, what was their corporate motto? Don't be evil. Thanks. Right? Thanks. That's what terrifies me most. I mean, I love engineers, some of my best friends are engineers. Well, you've got a bunch of engineers out there who think that that's the kind of moral complexity they're going to face. It's really scary. It's scary. It's scary. So, by contrast, Plato says that what would count as being just is a very difficult thing to figure out. And he goes on to start to define justice. And he defines it in terms of the city. Each piece of the city has something it's supposed to do. There's a group, I won't go into all the details here, but there's a group of groups of people that are better at doing certain things than others. These auxiliaries are military defenders that keep the city safe. The craftspeople are the people that build the stuff that we want to have in our city. And then there's this other group called the guardians. These are the wisest of the auxiliaries, of those that we've put in possession of the armaments. They get to get that status of being in possession of the arms only because they've earned their way through strenuous education that works them through questions of justice. The ones that are the best at that education at the age of 50 get a chance to be guardians of the city. And it's only after a rigorous system of education that centers on the question of justice that we figure out who's going to run us. So the ideal city, we're told, and that gives us a sense of understanding justice itself, is when each of these groups does what they're supposed to do, and when each of these groups follows what's best for them. For the guardians, the best thing for them, the best virtue they can achieve is to be wise. For the auxiliaries, the best virtue they can achieve is to be courageous. And for the craftspeople, the best virtue they can achieve is to be temperate. Now, the wisdom that the guardians are going to have is the particular wisdom of ruling well. And this is something that he spends a little bit more time talking about. Particular wisdom of ruling well. It's not being a carpenter. It's not being a bronze worker. It's not being a shoemaker. It's not being a maker of any particular thing. It's a maker of a just society. And that's a special kind of skill, specialized skill. The auxiliaries are going to follow their courage by engaging in having a correct and lawful belief on what it is, what we should fear and what we should not fear. Craftspeople need temperance, and that means self-mastery of certain sorts of pleasures and appetites. Plato is no fan of bodily pleasures. He's an anti-body person. The bodily pleasures only get in your way and never help you achieve. Now, justice is a mix of all of these. Justice emerges from each group pursuing its particular virtue. So as long as this group keeps focusing on temperance, we're okay. If this group starts focusing on courage or wisdom, we're in trouble. If this group starts focusing on temperance instead of courage or wisdom, we're in trouble. Each group needs to do what it's supposed to do. And that's going to make the most just city. See if you all have any questions on that. There's a little bit more to say, but I'm going to move along quickly. We've got I want to spend a little time with Aristotle before we close up. I wanted to do something like that, but I won't do it. Okay, Aristotle. His dates are 384 to 322 BCE. The texts that I'm mostly referring to here come from the Politics and the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle was Plato's student, and you know how different their philosophies are. You can just imagine Aristotle sitting and listening to Plato go on and on and on with vehement disagreements, and probably being one of those people that says, well, no, Socrates, it doesn't seem, and always getting shut down and just waiting for the day when he could write his own philosophy, which Aristotle does, thank goodness, and has sometimes contrasting things to say from Plato, and that's true in the case of the city as well. Aristotle's mostly interested in a sort of hunks of the world. And the hunks of the world that Aristotle's interested in are the ones that he sees as organic wholes. These are the pieces of the world that cohere and stay together. That, for him, is the most interesting thing. Other philosophers might try to look for some primary material out of which everything's made. That's of interest to some people. Plato was very interested in these moral questions and questions of justice. Aristotle was really interested in describing how whole things behave and why they do what they do. Let me just start off with an experiment for you. Okay. So I've got this piece of reality, all right? Here's my experiment. Okay. 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 I know for sure that this piece of the material world wants to be with the rest of the material world, which is under our feet, the earth. Now we say to ourselves, come on, right? Wants. Aristotle says that inert matter, non-living matter, what does it want to do? It clumps. It wants to clump with other non-living matter, all right? Now, I say to myself, okay, fine, it seems a little, but think about it. I mean, we talk about gravity. Gravity is the principle by which matter clumps. It's a description of something that Aristotle was describing in his own way of talking about it as well. For Aristotle, it's much more sensible to talk about, rather than talk about some abstraction like gravity, it's much more sensible to talk about the kind of behavior that's built into the different parts of the world around us. There's behavior built into this thing, the keys or the rock or the stone or whatever I have in here. Inanimate matter, its behavior is to want to clump with other inanimate matter. More complex things have other things that they want to do. I'll give you another example here. Let's see if I can get... I want to come back to this. Okay. So here's my dog, Blue. And you could say, so what does a dog want to do? Right? Right? Now, those of you who have dogs might say, well, wait a minute, you're selling the dog short. That's not, I mean, my dog does this, but she does this when she doesn't have available to her the thing she really wants to do, which is this. She wants to be in a forest chasing after little creatures. She wants to try to hunt down and kill birds and little furry mammals in the forest. That's what she wants to do. She is built to do that. That's thriving. For Aristotle, that is something being what it's supposed to be. It's like the keys joining the rest of the earth. The different parts of the world around us that we see have behaviors built into them. This one wants to hunt and kill small animals. And she's also very gentle, and she's really fun. She's a very nice dog. But the world around us has ways that it behaves. Now, how do human beings behave? Here's, let's just start off with this. Aristotle tells us, it follows that the state belongs to the class of objects which exist by nature, and that a human being is by nature a political animal. Now, some folks, I mean, you watch MSNBC, and Joe Scarborough loves to reference that. And what does he mean by it? Well, he means we can't wait to get into the back and forth of contentious argumentation based on public policy. I think that's what they think Aristotle meant. Well, you and I both know that's not what Aristotle meant at all. The Greek down here focuses in on this politikon zoon. This is that's the political. Well, that looks a lot like a word we all know. The city. So I think that probably a better translation of a human being is by nature a political animal is that a human being is by nature a city animal. We're city creatures. We, by nature, clump together. And when we clump together, Aristotle says the natural clumping group that's perfect for us, that's not too big, not too small, is the city. The clan's a little too small. The group of clans in a small village is too small. The city is just the right size. It's the natural place that a human being belongs. I grew up in Michigan, in a place that wasn't near a city, and I always knew that this was right. Getting to Philadelphia, I was, okay, I get it. So Aristotle says we have things that we tend to do for us, for human beings living in cities, is what we do. We clump. And this clumping is natural to us. A couple things of note. It's natural to us to form this cultural thing. Most of us would talk about cities as being a formation of culture, right? This is just cult. That's what humans do, is have cultures. And we would put a strong divide between nature and culture. Aristotle lived in a time also when there was a strong divide between nature and culture. In fact, we inherit this distinction from the Greeks that Aristotle's with. So he's being provocative, I think, when he's saying that this great cultural formation of the city emerges from us naturally. But that's straightforwardly what he says. So we have in us, by nature, a form that many of us would think of as being mostly culture. Now, Aristotle has further kinds of, I'll just do a final piece here, explanation. In order to really understand something, you've got to look at what causes it. And to understand what causes anything, you've got to look at four pieces to the causation: the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final. I'll give you an example. So we have here at the Penn Museum this marvelous neck amphora. It's on display now, I believe. You can go up and see it. And let's take a look at how Aristotle would analyze this thing. What's its material, formal, efficient, and final causes? Well, its material causes the clay. How does it work as what it's supposed to be, as the thing that it is? Well, it works that because it has this clay material. What's the formal cause behind this thing? What is the explanation for why it's in the form it is. That's the vase shape. That's the shape that many potters over time realized was the most efficient way to have wine stored and poured. What's the efficient cause? Well, it's the potter that makes the thing. And you've got to talk about where the thing came from in order to really understand it. Well, there's a potter behind it that puts the muscle into making it actually happen. But that potter's not just sort of willy-nilly mushing clay around. The potter is working from a purpose, a final purpose. The purpose is that the thing needs to hold wine. Now, to understand this vase, we've got to understand all of these four causes. And once we understand those four causes, we understand the vase. Okay? Now, a city for Aristotle. We can look at it in the same way. What's its material, formal, efficient, and final causes? Material. Humans, we, human beings, are the main material of what a city is made up of. Then also the resources that we bring to bear to answer the needs that we have. What's its formal cause? It's the Constitution that's set up. The laws that are written down that shape it, that make it give it the shape that it has. It's a formal cause. What's its efficient cause? It's ruler. The ruler is required to enact the form of the Constitution in the material of the humans and resources that are there. And what's its final cause? What's the point of a city, according to Aristotle? Well, the point of a city is not small. It's the good life. It's human thriving. In other words, what Aristotle's claiming is that what we want a city to do is to do what my dog does in the woods. We want the city to produce an outcome such that human beings are doing their human being thing that they're specifically built by nature to do. And for Aristotle, it's to pursue moral and intellectual virtue. That's what we do. That's what makes us distinctive and what makes us different from the other animals. Some will say that sounds naive, people aren't all good. That's not what Aristotle's saying. All of us pursue what we think is moral and intellectual virtue. Many of us make mistakes. All of us make mistakes. But what motivates our behavior is what Aristotle's always interested in, and what motivates it for him is our desire for the good. So we've come a long way from Homer. There, the city was this main marker of identity and a kind of protective citadel structure that keeps the enemies at bay. Could be looked at as a kind of macrocosm of the house of the ruler. Then in Plato, what's the city? Well, it's the main mechanism for him to pursue this question of justice. And at the end of the story, becomes for him the main mechanism of producing justice. The Republic tells us that the city is the place that makes justice happen for human beings. And for Aristotle, it is what is most natural to us, is to be city creatures, living in the space that we are in. So I'll look forward to your questions, and then I'll also look forward to, after a few minutes of questions, going back out into this marvelous city. And I hope you do too. Thanks for your attention. We do have a mic wandering around, so we'll do our best to get that to you. Question over here?
Hello?
Hi.
Oikos is the basis of the word economy,
Yes.
and temples were banks. Well,
That's cynical.
okay.
They had lots of money in them.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
You didn't mention much about money.
No.
And nowadays we think about cities as an engine for making money. So how does that apply to these three?
I'd answer, first of all, with the first two of, the two examples, Troy and Athens. No question that Troy and Athens were what they were because they were the wealthiest places nearby. I mean, why did we get democracy and tragedy and philosophy in Athens? I think you've got to say it came because the economy came first. So, yeah, Athens was the wealthiest city of its day. Troy was the wealthiest city of its day. Now, what would Homer say to an observation that, well, we think a city is by definition a wealth creation machine? Homer would say, yeah, probably, right? Okay, so no, it wouldn't sound, I mean, it's just straightforward. Plato, goodness no, right? You've mixed up the priorities. What you're talking about, Plato would say, I think, is that you're talking about a means as if it were an end in itself. What do you do with your money? I mean, do you enjoy it? Do you put it on the wall? Does it sing to you? Does it produce any happiness? Does it produce any good in the world? Well, not in and of itself. It's a means by which a person is going to get something done. So resources are themselves, at best he's agnostic on resources. And in fact, Plato would probably also say more money is deleterious to the pursuit of a truly just life. Because it tempts you into physical pleasures, and physical pleasures are never the way true happiness happens. Aristotle, sure, yeah, money there, but again, it would be a problem of, I think he would see this as a problem of mixing up the causes. Final cause for a city is not to get more money. Money's just stuff that's like a pursuit of a material cause is to have more resources around. That's fine, but to what end? To what point? And we don't do things pointlessly. Human beings don't do things pointlessly. And if we misstate what our point is, I think he thinks we're going to misunderstand what we're about, what we're up to. Okay. Yeah.
To what extent were the Greek thinkers simply describing what they were experiencing in the city, and to what extent was it an original thought? If they had been in some village somewhere, would they have come up with the same ideas as opposed to living in Athens at the time?
Gosh, I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, I can't imagine that, right? So I think that it is reflecting the vibrant atmosphere of classical Athens, Plato and Aristotle both. And there's other specific pieces of what Athens was all about, I think, that people have looked to traditionally to try to explain what's distinctive about Athens. It gets to be tricky business. It's hard to say exactly what it is. But no, I think that the ideas that grow out because of the specific place they come from, for sure. Yeah.
When Dionysus invited Plato to come to Sicily and be the philosopher king and apply his theories, it really didn't work out.
Didn't work out. That's true.
Why do you think that is?
The mistakes of implementation and the specifics of that historical circumstance, by which I mean the scholarly community, has more evidence at its fingertips than I have at my fingertips. So I don't want to venture off into territory that others could answer much better for you. But I would say that, again, what Plato would be talking about is, well, there is an ideal of what a city is. And no iteration of a city is going to be perfect, but to have the ideal is a necessary prerequisite ever to know whether your city is any good or not. So what he was trying to produce in the Republic was an ideal city. And right, it turned out that he was a much better philosopher than he was a city builder. Well, yes. I think that from this ancient evidence, cities definitely can become too big. For Aristotle, there's a natural size to everything. And once something gets beyond that natural size, it's unstable. Now, they would have very little to help us with on, say, whether cultural diversity or cultural variance was some important piece of a city. Most of them were culturally, utterly homogeneous. Now, surely aspects of chauvinism come part and parcel with that cultural homogeneity. But I also would say, just in terms of what's in Greek cultural DNA, you've also got Homer's Odyssey, in which the whole point is to go see the wide world. And people that don't get out and see strange ways of doing things, different ways of doing things, other cultures, and don't have a sense of being able to communicate with them, they're hopeless. They're monsters, and only monsters don't know how to sail, okay, in Homer's world. So you've got to know how to sail to go out and build bridges. Whether there's some analogy that we can make to our world and where are we, I don't know. But no, Plato and Aristotle's city was very homogeneous. And it didn't instill in them any, this is back to the city of, whether the physical circumstances or the setting produces the thought. They have very little thoughtfulness when it comes to this question of cultural kinds of complexity, cultural differences. How might we negotiate between these things? For them, it was mostly a non-issue. It was a blind spot for them. And it was a blind spot, I think, partly because they lived in a city that was utterly homogeneous.
The issue with city design over decades or centuries, have you found, this isn't philosophical, it's more practical type of question. Have you found a lot of commonality? Obviously, where they have waterways, you can have commerce from that aspect. But did you find any commonality over the centuries or different cultures of planning? It's kind of a general question.
Well, and it is, again, another place where the scholarly community has much more knowledge at its fingertips in the general than I do at my own, so I won't be able to give very good. But I would say it is expected in Homer and Aristotle's time that the basic shape of a city is the same. It's the thing that works well. You've got walls, not like the Trojan ones, but walls that guard the perimeters. You've got a marketplace where everything happens. Economy, politics, social gathering, all happens in the marketplace. You've got a political arena where ideas are exchanged and the nuts and bolts of the law are worked out. And then you've got a temple. And the temple is a place where the civic religion is practiced. And I use civic religion not because I think that they had, all I mean to say there is that their focus on a divinity was almost always through the lens of a city. So the Athens is Athens because it's Athena's city. And her temple is at the top of the main citadel there. And that's where she lives. And one participates in the civic cult because it's a good thing to do to be an Athenian. And to be against that would be, like being against the Eagles or something. Just feel like, it's something we all agree on. And it's beneficent and it's mostly. So there would be that space too. And Plato and Aristotle, in their own specifics of building out the city, all expect those pieces to be there. The agora, a temple, a political space, and a wall, rather, to protect it.
So Aristotle taught Alexander the Great.
Yes.
Do you think he said to him, "Go east, young man, found more cities"? I mean, what do you think he said to him about establishing more cities?
I don't know. I don't know. I think that, and this comes back to the money question. Aristotle taught Alexander because that's where the money was. Alexander's father had discovered a massive silver mine, got control of it, and used that. And all of a sudden, the Macedonians, these are, we are Athenians in this room. They're not us. They're from the north. They're a little uncivilized. They're near Thrace. I mean, they're just, and all of a sudden they arrive as if they're, and Aristotle sees which way the wind's blowing and sidles right up to Alexander. Now, yeah, and it works. I mean, it's exciting. It's interesting. So, he does tutor Alexander. I don't, now, I would need to know a lot more about Alexander. My colleague Jeremy McInerney in my department would. But I need to know a lot more about it to see what kind of predisposition does this person have. In other words, we all know that there are some impulse to have people around who pursue these kind of esoteric things like philosophy and others. It's nice to have them around. They're kind of decorative and nice to have at dinner parties. And they might even also sort of improve your own social status because, look, you've got one of those. It's like, so it could be that that's what Alexander was expecting out of Aristotle. I don't know. And this is another case where a colleague that would know more about Alexander might have a stronger view on this. But that's just another. I guess the better answer is I don't know.
speak to the collapse of cities?
Yes. And I'll talk to the one after the 1250 BC, after the conquering, in that zone. There's between the time that Homer is writing in and the time he's talking about, in that 500 years, is a time when these massive Troys of the Mediterranean disappear. A little too strong a word, but they mostly decay, and we have a lack of monumental building, a lack of commerce, a lack of exchange, all from about 1100 BCE until about 750 BCE. Nothing's going on. And we don't know exactly what happened. There's reference to the sea peoples, whoever they are, as potentially groups of marauding, piratical kind of pirates that got into these, found a way into these massive Mycenaean cities and figured out a weak point and just raised them all. And once you break what's been built over many centuries, you can't just put it back together. So the cities, the large Mycenaean cities, all fell apart shortly after the Trojan War. It happened in Greece, it happened in the Levant, it happened in Troy. So it's a strange thing that happened in that part of the world, but it did. And the causation is mysterious. We don't know for sure why it was. And once things started to go south, they went really south. So, I think the lessons of history are instructive in all kinds of ways. And to realize the precious quality of what a person has and its temporariness is, I think, always a salutary lesson, particularly in a time and a place that we live in now, which would be unthinkable in terms of its possibilities for them back then, even at the height of things. Sure.
We have time for one more question.
What and where were the sources of food for cities of that size that you
Yes.
showed us?
In that representation of Troy and Athens that we saw, mostly the farm was outside the wall. Now, there would be room for some farming on the inside, but it would have been really for emergencies, for sieges that were laid. And so, according to the story, the Greek army was parked outside that Trojan citadel for 9 years before the Iliad and 10 years altogether, and must have made the gathering of food very difficult. Now, the Trojans, Homer talks about the Trojans trading with their neighbors to somehow get in supplies, so the siege wasn't total. But no, mostly the farmland was in exposed areas. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much.